You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So, John, thanks so much for joining us tonight. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. So, why don't we jump straight in? Why don't you start by just telling us what it was that moved you to write A Week in the Life of a Slave?
Sure, Michael. Paul's letter to Philemon has been with me in one form or another since I was an early teenager. Growing up in a Christian home, my family would have morning Bible studies 5 days a week, and I remember one morning my father talking about Paul's letter to Philemon, and he actually was outlining the interpretation of the letter based on a commentary by John Knox in the 1960s. In fact, I actually bring up some of John Knox's theories towards the end of the Week in the Life of a Slave. But, the whole idea of a slave who ran away, encountered Paul, became a Christian, and returned, and that Paul would write a letter, only 335 words in the original Greek, and that it ended up in the New Testament, it just raised all kinds of questions for me. Who were these people? Why was this letter originally written? And so I eventually ended up writing a master's thesis on it, and then eventually interest in slavery in the New Testament led me to write my PhD thesis at the University of Durham. There I wrote it on slavery metaphors. I actually began writing this book in 2012 after touring the site of Ephesus in Turkey. Kind of sparked my imagination, and as I was in the van traveling around the country, pulled out my laptop and started writing. So that's sort of a short history of it.
Right, absolutely. I was amazed that I'm holding an entire book that, was based off of basically a one-page epistle. That's awesome. So, it obviously shows, as you mentioned, you've done a lot of research on the subject. With that being said, could you maybe share a bit of, with the audience about the life of a slave in this time period and how slavery perhaps was perceived by the newly born Christians?
Sure. One thing that I tried to accomplish in the book is to help modern Christians to understand that in many ways, slavery in the ancient world was very similar to what was experienced in the New World here. Apart from the fact that in the ancient world it was not based on race or the color of your skin, like it was here in North America, there are many similarities of what it was like to be a slave. For quite a while, it was not unusual in New Testament scholarship circles to sort of kind of play down what was going on in the Roman world, partly out of embarrassment of what had, happened here in North America and, of course, in other places in the New World. But as we begin studying slavery more and more in the ancient world, what we really do come to the conclusion is owning another human being was never a really good idea to begin with. And, even though certainly you'll hear people talk that, sometimes there's examples of slaves and masters who had a good relationship together. Again, in general, the idea, though, of owning another human being was, again, not a good idea. And I think what we're seeing in the New Testament is a group of people who are coming into their own understanding of what it means to have freedom in Christ, yet they're also dealing with their social context, a society, a economic system that depends heavily on slavery. And so what I try to demonstrate in the book is I'm not convinced, based on what we know from early Christianity, that not every Christian was convinced that slavery was a bad thing in those days. Some of them certainly would have, but not everybody would have. And it's sometimes we get the impression that the church came out of Pentecost and they saw everything clearly, but in reality, the church was learning quite a bit about itself and the world God created along the way. And there was a learning curve for some people. So I try to demonstrate that tension in the book that I think we hear going on inside the New Testament itself.
Right, absolutely. And you did a great job of that. So maybe you could share with us, if the reader could only take away one or two things from A Week in the Life of a Slave, what is it you would want them to take away the most?
I think one thing I would want them to understand is that, first of all, early Christianity was breaking down social barriers, particularly between slave and free, but as I also try to highlight in the book, between genders, women receiving somewhat prominent roles in the church in early Christianity. Yet at the same time, as I said in a previous question, I think we see evidence that some early Christians were maybe resistant to this. They didn't understand how can, for instance, in the case of Philemon and Onesimus, how does a master and the slave interact if they're both Christians, but yet they're still master and slave? So for instance, if Philemon is hosting the church in his home, does Onesimus get to participate in that church worship experience, or is he merely serving the guests? And it must have been quite a struggle for the early church to try and determine how to do that. And I think what I'm trying to help people to see, Michael, is that Christianity, our theology, and our understanding of the world around us has been developing since the very beginning of the New Testament itself, and that the New Testament gives us a window into that. I often tell my students there's no such thing as the golden age of the church. The church has been struggling since the very beginning in the book of Acts, and I take that as actually good news, because it means we didn't mess things up. God has been dealing with us as human beings from the beginning, and I'm thankful for that. He's accepted us knowing who we are as human beings, and yet invites us in and allows us to be changed through the grace, through His grace and through the love of Christ.
Amen. I guess others have written on biblical slavery. What would you say is the most unique thing about this historical novel?
Well, I think what, particularly as it focuses on Philemon, it brings together, hopefully, some of our best knowledge historically of what it was like to be a slave, while at the same time drawing on particularly what Paul says about slavery in the New Testament. As you go through the book, as the readers go through it, what I really like about this series and what attracted me to publish this book in this series is that not only do you have a hopefully believable narrative that explains what was going on in the ancient world with Paul, Onesimus, and Philemon, but you get these dialogue boxes along the way that get to teach you about real history that was taking place, as well as pictures and things like that. In fact, I joke with my wife. I said, this is one of my few books that I've written that she'll read. That's because it has pictures in it.
Uh-oh. And you're still married. That's awesome.
It's all right. She actually, out of everything I've read, she's actually read through several proofs of this for me, and she enjoyed it, so that was a good sign.
Right.
But for myself, one reason why I wanted to write the book and what I hope is unique about it is, and I even said in the preface, this is really for my students. I saw this as an accessible way and hopefully an interesting way to teach them history rather than just simply outlining facts. I wanted to draw them into the world of early Christianity, of the church, and hopefully have a chance to experience it a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely makes it a little more, I guess entertaining would be the right word, as you're walking through and see how people or the main characters experience the world and what's going on around them rather than just the straight facts. So yeah, I'll have to agree with you there. It's awesome. Do you have any final words you'd like to share with Edge of Faith before we close the discussion?
I would say that in light of what's been going on in our nation and our culture recently, particularly as it relates to not just race relations, but the legacy of slavery here in the United States or just North America in general. I think now as I think about the book, I'm hoping that my students and others that read it will be able to see again that slavery again was never a good idea, and that it tends, that slavery ultimately ends up being one human being committing violence against another. And while many of us, of course, have not experienced slavery in this particular age, it can perhaps help us to understand what recent history was like, as well as perhaps why we still struggle with these things today. Slavery leaves a lasting mark on the people that it impacts, but also I think the society and the history that belongs to that society. So, hopefully then people will walk away not looking and reading about slavery in the New Testament and saying, oh, it was just, it was like an apprenticeship. No, it was a really difficult social issue. And the New Testament gives us a window to look into this and say, okay, how did the early church deal with it? And also, how did they struggle with it? Which, again, to me is encouraging as I look at what's going on in the world around us. There's many difficult topics to get things right. And I think the New Testament shows us that it's okay to struggle as we continue to seek God in all of this.
Absolutely, yeah. Definitely have to put God first in everything we do, and I think that would be where we get to the right answer. John, thank you so much for talking with us. Thanks again for writing the book, A Week in the Life of a Slave, InterVarsity Press, and it's part of a series, as you mentioned, on the week in the life of, and it's from everything from a Roman citizen to a week in the life of Jerusalem. I mean, it's a wonderful series, so everyone should check it out. And thank you, sir, so much.
All right, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it, and I hope your audience enjoys the book, and I'd love to hear from them.